Good afternoon. Welcome everyone and my colleagues and our distinguished witnesses to the Subcommittee on the Asia and Pacific hearing. The ranking member, Mr. Feliu-Mavega, is not able to be here today because he is accompanying the body of a soldier who was killed in Afghanistan back to American Samoa, Mr. Feliu-Mavega's district. Our thoughts and prayers are certainly with the family of First Lieutenant Jason Asatoma Tongi, and Mr. Berra will be sitting in here and replacing Mr. Feliu-Mavega here this afternoon, and he and I will be making opening statements now, and other members, as they arrive, will be recognized for 1 minute to make a statement if they should wish to do so. We find ourselves today at an extraordinarily unusual time in history, one in which political changes are taking shape in nearly every corner of the world. As we look across the Indian Ocean, the beacon of hope and change in Asia, it seemed 2 years ago, was the relatively unknown, isolated country we call Burma, or Myanmar, but we prefer Burma. Today, nearly everyone knows about this nation in some way and has heard of democracy activist Aung San Suu Kyi, who sacrificed years of her life to improve her country's plight. In 2011, she testified via video before this subcommittee, expressing her resounding hope of change for her people. 2 years later, her wish has not yet become reality. The Burma we see today is at first glance much different than the one we knew only a few years ago. Businesses around the globe have rushed in, seeking a stake in Burma's economy and its untouched natural resources. Sanctions were lifted. Investors and tourists are moving across its borders. Some have called Burma the last Wild West of Asia. Named as one of the top travel destinations of the year due to its white beaches and serene Buddhist architecture and pristine beauty, I'm unfortunately not so sure how long that title will last. Countries around the world felt that they could now cross one more dictatorship off their list. And while Burma's sudden and unexpected democratic changes, which opened it to the world, was indeed incredible, we are unfortunately realizing that all this hype may have been premature. Those rose-colored glasses made the situation look better than it probably truly was underneath. The new motto for reforms in Burma, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, at least that's what the Obama administration is using, which is in considerable contrast to its overly optimistic depiction of reforms only a year ago. After 2 years of symbolic visits and appointments and grand gestures and ceremonial photo ops, the tone is finally mellowing as the international community realizes Burma's future is filled with challenges. The situation there is extremely fragile. All of the reforms to date could be reversed, unfortunately, with very little effort. Just a few days ago, Aung San Suu Kyi warned the U.S. that, quote, now it is more important than ever to look at the situation in Burma very objectively and not to be over-optimistic and recognize that Burma is not yet a democracy until its constitution is changed, unquote. She also made it clear that legal challenges are essential to end the ethnic conflicts, including attacks led by Burmese government forces against the Kachin community. The world needs to take note. The escalation of human rights abuses committed by the Burmese military and the civil unrest between Burma's Buddhist majority and Muslim minorities is threatening the progression of future political reforms in Burma. The effects of the surging anti-Muslim movement and ensuing violence has already been staggering. Over 250,000 people have been displaced, over 10,000 homes destroyed, and nearly 300 people killed. Evidence shows the Burmese military perpetrated some of these attacks directly. In other situations, the military and police just stood by and watched the violence unfold without taking appropriate action. A humanitarian crisis is unfolding before our very eyes. What's more, nearly 200 political prisoners remain behind bars, and this does not include the nearly 1,000 Rohingya and 200 Kachin prisoners of conscience who have been arrested and detained over the past year for their religion or ethnicity. This is unacceptable. These are actions repressive regimes take and use to intimidate their own people. how the Obama administration reacted to the blatant human rights violations and unfulfilled promises. They've offered more rewards and deals and concessions. Let's take a quick look. The administration lifted investment sanctions, lifted import bans, allowed Burma's military to observe Cobra Gold, the largest military exercise in the world, lifted visa bans on top Burmese politicians, hosted President Thein at the White House in Maine, signed a trade and investment framework agreement, began the process of admitting Burma into the Generalized System of Preferences program. And most recently, the administration initiated military-to-military engagement with Burma, which comes far too soon in light of the military's strong influence in Burma and continuation of human rights abuses against ethnic minorities. Without established benchmarks, this step, in my view, is hasty and poses a risk of failure for the United States' entire engagement strategy with respect to Burma. It's clear that the U.S. is committed to helping Burma succeed, but why is it the only thing this administration is doing is giving and then giving more? The engagement process needs to slow down, I believe, until it becomes apparent that the Burmese regime intends to truly reform. I believe the administration needs to reassess its strategy and take a step back because Burma has not yet demonstrated that it is truly committed to reforming. Without a clear roadmap, it's unclear whether future reforms in Burma will be consistent with goals established under U.S. laws. I look forward to hearing from our distinguished witnesses today about their assessment of the political environment in Burma, the growing human rights abuses among ethnic groups, and the U.S. engagement strategy with Burma. And now I'd like to turn to the ranking member here this afternoon, Mr. Barrett, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Shabbat, and thank you for holding this important hearing to discuss Burma's ongoing reform efforts. It's an incredibly important discussion for us to have, particularly with how young the democracy is. While we know real progress has been made, we also can't ignore that there's still much to be done. I continue to be particularly troubled by ongoing reports of ethnic violence, remaining political prisoners, suppression, mass arrests, and raids on homes and monasteries. But after almost 5 decades of brutal military repression, hope and optimism remain alive in Burma. But the truth is, for this hope and optimism to continue, there are major challenges that Burma will need to overcome. I believe that the United States can aid in solving these challenges, but as the world's greatest democracy, we have to do more than just aid. We must also send a clear-cut message of what our values are, and that the United States, in its hope for success, will not tolerate human rights abuses and oppression. As Burma transitions from instability to a country of democratic rule, this institution, Congress, and the administration must continually consider and review our actions. I look forward to hearing the testimony of each of the witnesses. I look forward to learning more about the status of where Burma is and hearing your thoughts and ideas about the policies that Congress and the administration should be thinking about and adopting in our hopes of creating a lasting and stable democracy in Burma. And again, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to thank you for calling this important hearing. And again, I look forward to the testimony of the witnesses. With that, I yield back.
Okay, thank you. I think we're getting the introductions to the panel, which I'll read here, but we're going to forego that at this point in time, and we're going to go ahead and start with Tom Andrews, and as soon as we get those, we'll go ahead and introduce the panel. But without further ado, and we now have him here, so hang on just a second. Mr. Andrews is President and CEO of United to End Genocide. He also serves as Senior Advisor to the National Democratic Institute for International Affairs. A former congressman from Maine, Tom was most recently served as National Director of Win Without War, a coalition of 40 national organizations promoting a national security strategy that calls for prudent use of military engagement. He's worked to promote democracy throughout the world, is an advocate of human rights in Burma, and has worked closely with the National Coalition Government of the Union of Burma. In the early 90s, he served as General Secretary of the Nobel Peace Laureate Campaign for Aung San Suu Kyi. Tom was elected to the Maine House of Representatives in 1982, the Maine Senate in 1984, and the United States House of Representatives in 1990. And we welcome you here, Tom. And our second witness will be Jennifer Quigley. Ms. Quigley is the Executive Director for the U.S. Campaign for Burma, where she works to ensure international policymakers support the movement for freedom and democracy in Burma, provide support for human rights and humanitarian needs, and seek to bring an end to crimes against humanity and impunity in Burma. She has worked on the movement for freedom and justice in Burma in different capacities for 10 years now. Prior to joining the U.S. Campaign for Burma, she worked for the Women's League of Burma and its member organizations on international advocacy and capacity building. And we welcome you here this afternoon. Next, is it Wakar or Wakar? Wakar. Thank you. Dr. Wakar Uddin is the Director General of the Arakan Rohingya Union, Chairman of the Burmese Rohingya Association of North America, and a professor at Penn State University. He received his undergraduate degree from the University of Nevada and a Ph.D. from University of Georgia. And we welcome you here, Dr. Uddin. And then finally, Ralph Corman, who is President and Chief Executive Officer, co-founder and board member of the Humpty Dumpty Institute, HDI, a private, non-governmental organization dedicated to enhancing ties between the U.S. Congress and the United Nations. Under Mr. Corman's leadership, the Institute has brought hundreds of members of Congress and their senior staff to UN headquarters, including myself, for private briefings. Previously, Mr. Corman served as Senior Vice President of MU-US Asset Management Company, LLC, and Senior Vice President of the United Nations Association of the United States. Prior to that, Mr. Corman served as Director of Research and Speechwriter to Ambassador Benjamin Netanyahu at Israel's permanent mission to the United Nations. He holds a bachelor's degree in Middle East Studies from Tel Aviv University and a master's degree in International Affairs from Columbia University. So we want to thank the entire panel here this afternoon, remind you of our 5-minute rule. There's a light system. The yellow light will let you know you got 1 minute to wrap up, and when the red light comes on, if you'd please wrap up your testimony close to that point, we would definitely appreciate it. And each of you has 5 minutes. Congressman Andrews, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so very much for holding this hearing. Thank you for your very comprehensive statement, Mr. Barrett. Thank you for yours. Indeed, a humanitarian crisis is underway for millions and millions of people in Burma. And you covered much of the fundamentals. I'd just like to talk about my own personal experience traveling in Burma earlier this summer, Mr. Chairman. I went to Arakan State in the west of Burma. I went to central and northern area of Mandalay. I visited Meekdala, and I also visited many neighborhoods in the capital city of Rangoon. Throughout my travels, I heard stories of violence, of systematic discrimination, of isolation, and the blanket oppression where every aspect of life of so many of these people is tightly controlled by the military. People described their life in terms of violence, their right to move from one village to another, even from one street to another, the right to earn a living, the right to get married, the right to have more than 2 children. Even the right to live with one's own family is dependent upon the permission of authorities, and most often only after the payment of bribes. Large numbers of people are forced to live in these conditions, Mr. Chairman, not because of anything they have done, but because of who they are and the God that they pray to. I found hate speech, a key precursor of genocide, is disturbingly prevalent in Burma. Fueling it is the systematic, well-organized, and well-funded campaign of hatred and bigotry known as 969. It is ominously reminiscent of the hateful propaganda directed at the Tutsi population and their sympathizers in the lead-up and during the Rwanda genocide. And I describe this activity in my written testimony, Mr. Chairman, and there's a photograph I brought of one of these rallies to you. But let me just quote one of the most prominent leaders of this 969 movement. When he was asked about Muslims, he said this, and I'm quoting, "Muslims are like African carp. They breed quickly, they are very violent, and they eat their own." That is a Buddhist monk who is a leader of the 969 movement. Mr. Chairman, the authorities in Burma do not want you to hear what I'm telling you this afternoon after being blocked by security agents at a roadside checkpoints when I attempted to visit some of the neighborhoods and IDP camps. I was finally able to get in. And here's what I wrote to some friends and colleagues from inside Burma. I'm traveling to parts of Burma that the government does not want me to see. I now realize why. Yesterday I saw burnt buildings and destroyed mosques. Met with those who had literally had to run for their lives after watching their homes and everything that they had worked for destroyed. They now live in abject poverty in makeshift camps, wanting desperately to return and rebuild their village, but being utterly terrified to do so. Many told me, yes, they are scared of the mobs and the escalating anti-Muslim fear-mongering and poison that fuels that violence. But they fear the Burma security forces and police even more. I've been running into plenty of these security forces. They have stopped, harassed, and followed me. Many intelligence agents have interrupted meetings with courageous people who were willing to tell me their story. 3 of these agents followed me yesterday to a meeting of an extraordinary Buddhist monk who had saved hundreds of Muslims from a mob by providing them shelter in his monastery. The agent sat in the back of the monastery hall taking notes of our conversation. Later, I was stopped and surrounded by several security forces shortly after passing their compound. They let me pass only after I showed them the photos in my camera and trashed those that they did not want to leave the country. Yesterday, at what I thought was a secret meeting at the home of a family of a village racked by violence, a neighbor came by to warn us that military intelligence agents were waiting across the street. I had 4 agents following me for the remainder of the day. These are some of the obstacles, Mr. Chairman, to learning and documenting the truth. This is the untold story of Burma, one that is not part of the sunny narratives that are so commonplace, and it is one that desperately needs to be told. I want to congratulate you for giving us this opportunity to air the truth that is happening as we speak inside of Burma, and I provide in some detail my findings in my written testimony. But by no means is this simply restricted to my own experience. The United Nations Special Rapporteur Thomas Quintana described in some detail his experience. He said, and I'm quoting, the severe restrictions on freedom of movement in Muslim IDP camps and Muslim villages remain in place. He cited the impunity of security forces and the lack of any form of justice for the Rohingya. I am deeply concerned, as you are, Mr. Chairman, of the signals that we are sending as a nation by the lifting of restrictions, of lifting the very sources of pressure that provided for the progress that we have seen in Burma. I believe this is a very dangerous course and should be re-examined and thoughtfully reviewed by this committee and by all. I am particularly concerned about the military-to-military relationships and the signals that this is sending to the Burmese military, who are responsible for egregious human rights violations that continue even as we speak. It is very important, Mr. Chairman, that the American public and that this Congress see the complete story of Burma, and that the policies that are in place right now be re-examined so that we are sending the right signals to the regime, the right signals to the military, and the right signals to those people in Burma who are living, as you described, this humanitarian crisis day in and day out. Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Andrews. Ms. Quigley, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman, Ranking Member, and members of the subcommittee. I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to speak today. It's been 2 years since Burma shifted out from outright military rule to a nominally civilian government. During the first year, President Thein Sein surprised the international community with his willingness to engage and implement a series of reforms, culminating with Aung San Suu Kyi's by-election victory in April 2012. Many governments, including the Obama administration, responded quickly, rushing to lift sanctions. The human rights community and Burma's ethnic minorities were skeptical that the Burmese government was interested in genuine reform, rather that they would do the minimal necessary to secure the removal of sanctions. We cautioned governments not to lift sanctions too soon, considering the constitutional barriers to democratic rule, national reconciliation, independence of the judiciary, and civilian control over the military. Once governments began to lift or suspend their sanctions, the pace of reforms slowed dramatically. Primary focus was placed on securing economic benefits from foreign investment and trade. In rural and ethnic minority areas, land confiscation became pandemic. Farmers and entire communities are being forced off of their land by government officials, the military, or their business cronies in anticipation of lucrative foreign investment partnerships. The Burmese parliament passed laws that legalize land confiscation, taking away people's ability to legally fight for their land. The Burmese authorities' desire to benefit from foreign investment has led to the breakdown of ceasefires with ethnic minorities. The Burmese military broke the ceasefire with the Shan State Army North in March 2013, attacking them, using villagers as forced labor, and displacing thousands, all in an effort to clear out an area that the Burmese government had signed a deal with a foreign company to build a hydropower dam. The Burmese army continues to break ceasefires, calling into question the sincerity of the Burmese government's commitment to national reconciliation. Shortly following the euphoria of Aung San Suu Kyi officially becoming a member of parliament, and the human rights situation turned from bad to worse. The violence broke out between Rakhine Buddhists and Burmese security forces on one side and Rohingya Muslims on the other. In the course of a few days, the violence displaced 100,000 people, the vast majority of whom are Rohingya Muslims who remain still today in squalid, internally displaced person camps. Burmese authorities destroyed mosques, mass arrests of Rohingya Muslims, and blocked humanitarian aid to displaced. The violence against the Rohingya continued to be fueled by hate speech throughout Burma, including by government officials. Alarmingly, many people throughout Burma, including prominent members of Burma's democracy movement, participated in the hate speech against the Rohingya and supported military authority in Rakhine State. On July 11th, 2012, President Thein Sein told the UN High Commissioner for Refugees that the only solution for the anti-Muslim conflict is to deport Rohingya to other countries and confine them to refugee camps, reminiscent of Hitler's message in the 1930s. Later that same day, President Obama issued waivers lifting the financial and investment sanctions on Burma. The Obama administration's waiver sent a strong message. Meeting human rights conditions and addressing concerns of ethnic minorities are no longer a requirement for receiving U.S. investment and relaxing sanctions. In September and early October of 2012, the U.S. lifted restrictions on international financial institutions' assistance to Burma and invited the Burmese military to observe the prestigious Cobra Gold joint military exercises. Seemingly emboldened by the international community's prioritization of Aung San Suu Kyi over anti-Muslim policies and human rights abuses, Burmese government ramped up restrictions on the Rohingya. In late October 2012, Burmese security forces carried out an ethnic cleansing campaign against the Rohingya Muslims, resulting in countless deaths, hundreds of women raped, the displacement of an additional 40,000 people, and destroyed villages. The following month, President Obama waived the majority of the Burmese import ban and became the first president to visit Burma. With nearly all sanctions lifted and repercussions from the international community nil, the Burmese authorities wrapped up their crackdown on activists and ethnic and religious minorities. Less than 2 weeks after President Obama visited Burma, police cracked down on nearly 100 protesters using white phosphorus, a chemical agent, to burn them. In December 2012 and January 2013, the Burmese military escalated its attacks against the Kachin for the first time, launching airstrikes and shelling. Shortly after that, the Paris Club of Creditors announced its intention to clear nearly $6 billion of Burmese debt. In addition to the lack of a robust response from the international community to allegations of ethnic cleansing and crimes against humanity, the Burmese government's decades-long promotion of Buddhist nationalism, anti-Muslim propaganda, divide-and-rule strategy, and system of impunity created an environment that fostered anti-Muslim violence. Between February and August of this year, anti-Muslim violence spread throughout Burma, with violence occurring in 23 townships across the country. The participation and complacency of security forces during the attacks, coupled with the lack of justice and accountability for any authority figures involved in the attacks, strongly indicates a need for an international independent investigation into crimes against humanity and a system of impunity to determine who is responsible, the culpability of the government, and access to judicial remedy. Without international action, anti-Muslim violence and discrimination will likely continue unabated. The United States must change the way it approaches Burma policy. During President Obama's trip to Burma last year, President Thein Sein made several promises of reform to address human rights issues. Nearly all of those promises remain unfulfilled. Clearly, the current approach is not working. U.S. government policy should incorporate and reflect the needs of the most persecuted populations. The Burmese government has demonstrated that They relent to international demands before we relax sanctions, not after. It would be a mistake to continue to offer carrots without first demanding concrete reforms in advance. Military and military relations should not proceed until the Burmese military demonstrates a genuine interest in reform by stopping all attacks throughout the country in both ceasefire and non-ceasefire areas. Training junior officers and soldiers on human rights does not address the main problem, that soldiers are committing human rights abuses on the orders of their military and political leaders. The Burmese military wants a relationship with the U.S. military. Ethnic minority communities want the U.S. to use this interest as leverage to attain concrete, genuine reform before allowing a relationship to move forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dr. Uddin, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for giving me the opportunity.
I want to hit the mic here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for giving me the opportunity to testify before the Foreign Affairs Asia Subcommittee. I would like to start with the post-election situation in Burma past 2 years. The political climate in Burma has not fundamentally improved for over the past 2 years, despite great expectations by the people of Burma and the international community for a genuine change. The junta's strategy of maintaining the status quo was effectively implemented through the national election in 2010. The impact of this false democratic process has disproportionately impacted the ethnic minorities, including Rohingya, Kachin, and Myanmar Muslims over the Burmans and Burma. The military junta's imposition of its apartheid policies for Rohingya, such as travel restrictions, marriage restrictions, land confiscation, deprivation of education, deprivation of freedom to worship, closure of places of worship is still continuing. In fact, there has been further tightening of this recently in Arakan, Rakhine State. Currently, there are some elements within the Burmese government colluding with Rakhine and Arakan state officials to make IDP, the internally displaced people, camps permanent or semi-permanent. The media is still not free for all people. Certain groups of people enjoy these rights more than others who has connection to the Burmese government. Rakhine National Democratic Party, RNDP, in collusion with some segment of Burmese government as well as the Ministry of Immigration, has recently introduced legislation in the parliament to launch a reinvestigation into Rohingya MPs in their ancestral backgrounds. These Rohingya MPs has been elected legally in the election in 2010. About U.S. administration's easing sanctions, I think the administration has moved very quickly to ease the sanction and relax the sanction. We believe that this is very short-sighted. This relaxation of sanction should have been more gradual, firmly incremental, with benchmarks. The Burmese government should meet each expectation by the international community before the second bar may be lifted. About military relationship with Burma, I am not a military strategist who can provide a detailed analysis of proposed military-to-military relations between Burma and the United States. However, as a concerned citizen, knowledgeable enough about Burmese military establishment, I strongly urge our government to avoid military relations with the government that is guilty of the worst crimes of our time. Establishing this relationship is way far too premature, we believe. About the growing conflict between the majority Buddhist and the minorities, the conflict between Buddhist and Muslim populations are overwhelmingly one-sided. Although it is termed as conflict, it is truly not a conflict. It is an attack on the minority by the majority. It's one-sided. It's backed by the Burmese forces, as we have seen that on videos and on the internet, on other news media coverage. Denial of basic rights, of systematic discrimination against Rohingya by the Burmese government created the fertile ground for nationalist Rakhine leadership and radical Buddhist monks to instigate fresh violence against Rohingya that has now spilled over to mainland Burma. About the implications of this conflict, the Burmanization policy, which is the purity, the ideology of purity of race and religion in Burma, that has been the central part of this problem situation in Burma. The violence against Rohingya and Burmese Muslims is part of a pattern of ultra-nationalism led by 969 movement, spearheaded by this monk Wirathu, is spearheading that, and Time magazine has extensive coverage, so as other major newspapers of the world. This cannot be allowed. Myanmar government cannot remain silent on this. Myanmar government must investigate this and stop this, the terror network, 969 terror network, which is clearly committing all this violence and instigating violence through hate speech. Recently, the Burmese government, in coordination with Rakhine state officials, reportedly designated Rohingya prisoners as non-political prisoners. In recent days, hundreds of Rohingya prisoners from age 11, 12 to 60, 65, quickly sentencing them to life imprisonment or long terms, 20, 30 years jail for committing violence or instigating violence. In fact, these people are the victims of violence who has lost their homes, their business, some losing family members. Achieving national reconciliation with the ethnic group is not as complex as Myanmar government is portraying. It is simpler, it is achievable. It is within the reach. Myanmar government is very powerful. It has strong influence on Rakhine ethnic groups, and Myanmar government a central role, a powerful role, can play a powerful role to mediate the reconciliation if it comes to the middle and play a central role as a true and sincere facilitator. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Doctor. Mr. Corman, you're recognized. Before you start, could I ask Dr. Uddin, what's the edition or what is the date on the Time magazine that you referred to in case other people might like to?
This is July 1st, 2013. It is a non-U.S. edition. It's edition for Europe, Middle East, Asia, and Africa.
Okay, very good. That's July 1st of this
July
year.
1st of 2013.
Okay, in case the staffs would want to get it or any of the folks in the audience today. Thank you very much. Mr. Corman, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Jabbat, Representative Bera, members of the subcommittee, thank you for...
If you could hit the mic there, just...
Is that better?
Yes.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to give testimony here today. As you mentioned, we do have a lot of interaction with Capitol Hill in our program with the UN, but as the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Humpty Dumpty Institute, we also do a lot of international development work around the world.
For those in the audience, just with the title, it's kind of an unusual title. Would you explain where the title comes from? And we won't take this out of your time.
Sure.
So.
We were I was with some colleagues in the back of a truck in Rwanda a few weeks after the genocide there, and these were people who wanted to try to change things, and we were in the back thinking about how we could create an effective, small organization that would do good work around the world. And we all came up with the tagline of putting the pieces back together because things were so broken. And it is also a very memorable a name. Lots of people don't forget it. When there are 10,000 NGOs that are affiliated with the UN, you have to try to find a way to keep people remembering what you're doing.
Thank you.
As I mentioned, we have this program with the UN and members of Congress, but we also do a lot of development work around the world. We build schools, provide medicine, construct health clinics, feed children, clear landmines in UXO. We dig wells, we put up latrines, we plant gardens, we grow fruit orchards, and we organize local business opportunities for indigenous populations. I'm here today because we do some work in Burma, and I want to come to you with my perspective from boots on the ground. from the actual development work that we're doing there, from our unique partners with whom we work and with whom we've engaged, and from the many, many people that I have talked to and run across during my travels throughout the entire country. My general impression is that most of the Burmese who I have talked to are absolutely extraordinarily thrilled by the speed and substance with which change and reform continues to take place in Burma. The Humpty Dumpty Institute was the first American NGO to begin a landmine program and a mine risk education program in Burma that was funded by the State Department. It is a huge problem in Burma. And also through this program, we developed a very close and official relationship with one of the most important Buddhist organizations in the country. The name of that organization is the Sitagu Association, under its very, very influential leader, the Venerable Sitagu Sayadaw. He has, and his organization has provided humanitarian support to millions of people throughout Burma. They have a network of clinics and hospitals all over the country. He's raised hundreds of millions of dollars for disaster relief in Burma, and his national food deliveries are very well known. The Sitagu Sayadaw's interfaith work is also very well known around the country and the region. For our program, we worked and partnered with this organization, and we chose to work in Kachin. That, of course, is the province, very troubled, bordering China, with a Christian majority. It is the only state where there is current fighting taking place, resulting in the displacement of large numbers of people. And the landmine problem there is huge and unchecked, and actually very little is still known about it. Very little, if any, international support is reaching this area, and our organization chose to start working there because the need there was the greatest. On my last trip to Burma, I spent an evening with Monsignor Francis Tang, the Roman Catholic Bishop of Kachin, Sitagu Sayadaw, and a few other people. We had a very, very interesting conversation about Burma and its future, and this conversation continues to be a deep source of optimism for me. We were 15 kilometers away from the border of China. We could hear mortars falling as we were speaking. Yet despite these very, very dire circumstances, these religious leaders that I was meeting with are very enthusiastic and very excited about the future. They work with one another, they talk to each other constantly, and believe that Burma is heading in the right direction. There are very, very serious bumps and bruises that are very painful along this path of reform. But the incredible progress made over the past 2 years has opened the doors to freedom and democracy for the people of Burma. It has infused the population with hope and optimism for a better life for themselves and for their children. This process, in my view, is irreversible, and these religious leaders have come to rely on this country, the United States, and you, to be strong partners and leaders to help guide their country along the path to democracy and rule of law. In terms of the sectarian violence between the Buddhist majority and the Muslim minority, the situation, as we have all heard, remains tense and serious. The vast majority of the victims here are Muslim. The displacement of these people and the violence directed toward them must be stopped. The perpetrators of this violence must be brought to justice, and at the end of the day, religious tolerance and the pursuit of interfaith cooperation must be a priority in Burma. There are Roman Catholics, Baptists, Mormons, Muslims, and Hindus. Freedom of worship is guaranteed by law and in practice. In major cities, pagodas, churches, mosques, Hindu temples are often side by side. And for any of you who have been there, there is an actually wonderful synagogue that is functioning in Yangon. Many of Burma's religious leaders believe that the Buddhist-Muslim violence has been stirred up by a handful of Burma's 500,000 monks, and that the overwhelming majority of monks support interfaith cooperation and want to see an end to this violence. U.S. USAID has a very robust program in Burma, and it is making a lot of headway. In the interest of time, I just want to end by saying that freedom, that religious tolerance, again, that there are many opportunities for efforts led by the State Department's Office of Religious Freedom to bring the different religious communities of Burma together in common cause to advance the nation's march to full freedom and democracy and the rule of law. Buddhist, Christian, and Muslim communities should all benefit from working together to solve problems through stronger collaboration and cooperation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and we'll go ahead and get to the questioning. At this time, I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes. First of all, and I want to thank all the witnesses for their testimony this afternoon. I thought all of them was really excellent. As I expressed in my opening statement, it's my belief that U.S. military engagement with Burma at this time is premature. There's no doubt that the Burmese military wants the U.S. to engage because it will bring them the legitimacy and prestige that most other countries have. I think most of you today, according to your testimony, shared that concern. Unfortunately, the administration seems to really have turned a blind eye to congressional concerns and has unfortunately continually refused our invitations to testify before this subcommittee about its plans. Congressman Andrews, let me go to you first. You stated in your testimony that, quote, further relations between our militaries must be based on standards of conduct, unquote. I agree, and I believe benchmarks need to be established. Ms. Quigley, I know you mentioned benchmarks as well, and used as conditions before the U.S. continues engagement with the Burmese military. Could you describe what benchmarks you think should be established before the U.S. proceeds militarily with the Burmese?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. Let me just say, first of all, the impunity has to stop. Those who have committed these gross human rights violations, and they're very well documented, need to be held to account. There has to be an international investigation of these atrocities. The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, the President of Burma promised our President that he would allow an office to be opened and permanently operating to investigate these atrocities. That still has not happened. So first of all, impunity. Secondly, civilians need to be in control of the military in Burma. That's not the way it is today. Aung San Suu Kyi, as you know, 2 years ago, ran the table in the elections, and her reward was to get 5% of the seats in the parliament. The military, on the other hand, are guaranteed 25% of the seats in parliament, an effective veto over whatever happens there. So civilian control needs to occur. The airstrikes on civilian populations has to stop, and those responsible for ordering those strikes need to be held accountable. I talked with someone 2 days ago who just returned from Kachin State, and he says attacks on civilians, sexual violence, destruction of property by soldiers continues to go on to this very day. He said he had evidence, he saw it just the other day. Use of child soldiers. Burma has pledged not to use child soldiers, but they continue to recruit children as young as 12 years old into the military. This is not rocket science. There are fundamental codes of conduct that need to be established, and it seems to me that if we're going to be engaging in military-to-military relations, we should first establish these benchmarks based upon these factors. Let me just say, Mr. Chairman, that just last month was the first bilateral meeting of defense ministers in over 20 years when U.S. Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel met with his counterpart in Burma on the sidelines of the ASEAN Defense Ministers meeting. These send dangerous signals. To have these atrocities going on, to have the military directly implicated in these atrocities, and for us to be engaging in further and further military-to-military engagement without benchmarks, I think is dangerous.
Okay. Thank you very much. Ms. Quigley, let me go to you next if I can. The U.S. ambassador to Burma has said that during his last visit to Kachin State, people were approaching him, begging the U.S. to talk to the military and work with them, and thanking the U.S. for sending the Defense Institute of International Legal Studies teams to Burma. Now, you stated in your testimony that ethnic minority groups want the U.S. to use the military's interest in engagement as leverage to attain concrete, genuine reform. At the same time, my understanding is that civil society and ethnic groups believe this type of engagement has come too soon. Would you explain why we're hearing these two competing messages, and which one should guide U.S. policy?
Yeah, I mean, we've been well aware that the administration has wanted to pursue military-to-military engagement for several months. And so this actually became a big focus of mine when I did my trip to Burma earlier this year. And so I also was in Kachin State. I was in Rangoon, and I was on the Thai-Burma border. And we made sure to ask everyone we met with what it was that they wanted, being well aware that some of them had already been approached by the U.S. government. And so when the U.S. government approached, whether that be Ambassador Mitchell or somebody on a State Department delegation, the question that the communities are asked are, would you like our military to train your military on human rights, international humanitarian law and international human rights law? And people are like, well, yeah, that'd be great. And if there's no follow-up questions. Yeah. When I say, do you want the Burmese military to have done something first? Oh, of course. Yeah. They just assumed that the U.S. would place a precondition on military-to-military engagement. And so we then got into conversations, and it's an ongoing one now that we've had for several months, is, well, what do you want those preconditions to be? And so they've laid out across multi-ethnic, not just Kachin, but Kachin, Karen, Shan, sort of you name it. The idea is they have to demonstrate they have an interest in reform by stopping the attacks. The Burmese military has done nothing so far to show that they're actually interested in reform. And so they feel as if that should be the most immediate of precursors to future engagement. They also want, and this one is a bit bigger, they want troop withdrawal. That is the biggest. It's why refugees don't want to return home. It's why IDPs won't return home, is that when the Burmese army is there, they don't want to be where the Burmese army is. And so they feel as if the U.S. government has that opportunity to use this leverage, in fact, that they want this relationship to get that. And then, of course, they have. That's just for human rights training. If you get onto the idea of any other attending Cobra Gold next year, other joint military trainings, they have a whole slew of preconditions that they want. And we're working with them right now to present that to Congress and to present that to the administration.
Okay. Thank you very much. My time's expired. A gentleman from California, Mr. Berry, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Great. Thank you, Chairman Chabot. Congressman Andrews and Mr. Schwerman, both of you in your opening comments referenced Rwanda and also referenced genocide. Can you expand on that in terms of what you're seeing when you're in Burma, and what that context is, and then also what we can do to certainly help avoid that, because none of us wants to see another Rwanda take place.
Thank you, Mr. Barrett. It's an excellent question. And if I was in Congress when the genocide of Rwanda was going on, and when I visited Rwanda, I literally sat down as I was at one of the memorial centers where 250,000 people are buried, and asked myself, my God, where was I when all this was going on? Where was I when the true warning signs and signals of a genocide were in place? It's very clear to me, as president of United to End Genocide, that the building blocks of genocide are in place in Burma right now. And the hate speech, the fear and intimidation, the isolation, the severe restrictions on people, the violence against people, the sending off of people to camps where they're totally isolated and totally controlled, all of this is a precursor to genocide and the building blocks of hate. And, someone has described this as inter-ethnic violence. I believe that it's much more than that. When you have the complicity documented by the United Nations, for example, and the Special Rapporteur, complicity of the state and the military in these acts, then there's a very, very serious problem that needs to be addressed. And no country in the world is better positioned to influence this situation than the United States. Everyone that I talked to when I mentioned this said unequivocally, of all the nations in the world, the United States is in the strongest position.
Thank you. As the son of 2 Holocaust survivors and someone who has had extensive experience visiting different sites where genocide has occurred, I don't think that such a foundation is laid in Burma. I have not seen it. I have talked to many, many political leaders. I have talked to many religious leaders. Yes, there are human rights abuses. Yes, there is injustice going on. But you have to remember that this process of democratic reform is only 2 years old. And there are going to be, as I mentioned, lots of problems and lots of challenges that both the government will have to face over the course of the next many, many years. And yes, there is, of course, our role as the United States to help guide them, help influence them onto all of the issues that and positions that have been talked about here. But I want to emphasize that this is not some national movement. There are many, many people who are Buddhist who are opposed to the violence. There are people who are opposed to many of the human rights abuses that in other areas. But at the same time, the leaders of these communities are talking to one another. There have been a number of meetings since May between Muslim leaders and Buddhist leaders to bring an end to the violence. And certainly there is a very close relationship between the leaders of Kachin and many prominent Buddhist leaders as well.
Would you say that most of the violence is confined to the Buddhist community and the Muslim community, or are you seeing it across all the ethnic minorities?
No, there's conflict going on in Kachin, okay, along the Chinese border, where government forces are fighting with the Kachin Independent Army, and there is. I think, though, much more to it than that. There are strategic areas, but they have come in with a much heavier engagement, the use of airplanes, for example. But at the end of the day, there is a lot of interaction between Kachin and the rest of Burma. Leaders are talking, and there is, I believe, a reason to be hopeful and a reason to be optimistic.
It's not going to run out of time. I would just, the second part of the question is, what should the United States government do to address this and help give Burma the best possibility?
Well, I believe somewhat differently than the rest of the panelists. I believe that the relationship should be deepened. I think more investment in the country is necessary, and that all sorts of entanglements and more relationships should be built on every level, in development, of course, democracy reform, because if we don't do it, there's no one else who's going to do it. And it's our role and obligation to do so.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Holding, is recognized for 5 minutes. Unless he'd like to defer to the gentleman from... Okay. Well, we'll recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Rohrabacher.
Well, thank you very much. And, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to express my appreciation to you for holding this hearing. Burma has, for many years, been very symbolic of the issues of freedom that are challenging civilization throughout the world. And shortly after I was elected to Congress the first time, I ended up going into the jungles in Burma and meeting with the students who had just been involved with a revolt against the military junta and they were chasing them through the jungles and mortaring their villages. These were unarmed groups of young people who were college students, basically. And since that time, they finally found refuge in the areas of the Karen and the Karennis and the border tribal peoples. And since then, all these years, all these 25 years, there's been this ongoing murder of innocent people by the government of Burma that made it a pariah of the nations of the world. Of course, a pariah except with the Chinese, who were using the Burmese junta as their puppets. They were indeed doing the bidding of the Chinese, and it got to such a point that it was too much for even the Burmese military, and that's why I think they've started in the right direction. Although what we're hearing about today should be a warning to all of us who felt that things were beginning to go in the right direction, that they are not necessarily going to go in the right direction unless we continue to be engaged in a very positive way and forceful way. U.S. military engagement, Mr. Chairman, as you have stated, U.S. military engagement with the Burmese government at this time, because of what we've heard at this hearing today, is clearly premature, unless we are to be taken, unless it is to be taken as excusing the type of abuses that we have heard spoken about and detailed today. There should be no, especially, there should be no military cooperation with the regime until the major atrocities being committed against the Muslim population ceases. Otherwise, it will be seen by the people who are committing the atrocities as a green light to go and murder innocent people, and it will be seen by people throughout the world as hypocrisy on the part of the United States because of our ready willingness to condemn Muslims anytime they are committing such acts of violence and atrocities against other peoples. There has been ethnic cleansing over these years that I have been in Congress that is very easy to identify. Where did the word ethnic cleansing come from? It came from Christian Serbs exterminating communities of Muslims in the Balkans, intentionally doing that. We now have a Buddhist ethnic cleansing of Muslims in Burma, just as we have seen Hindu ethnic cleansing of Muslims in the Kashmir. None of this excuses any Muslim for killing any unarmed person anywhere in the world. But if we're going to reach out to the Islamic community on this planet and tell them that they are not meeting the standards of civilization by backing the radicals among their own religious faith who are committing horrible acts of terrorism against unarmed people throughout the world, we've got to make sure that when Muslims are the victims, we stand up for them as well. And nowhere is that clearer than here in Burma. And let us note now about others. Yes, the Muslims are being attacked, but from my sources of information, the attacks, especially air attacks on the Karennis and the Karens and the other ethnic groups along the border continues. And if it is indeed there's been reform and they're heading towards more freedom in Burma, well, then those air attacks should have ceased a long time ago. Any air attack on a portion of Burma by the Burmese military is an admission that the repression of peoples in Burma continues. We must be strong about it. I hope this hearing delivers that message, Mr. Chairman, to the Burmese military that we don't expect a big announcement and then we're going to walk away and let them have their way. No, they made a big announcement that they're changing direction. We must see a continued movement in the right direction and not continued atrocities and human rights abuses. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. And we don't necessarily need a response. I don't think there was a question in there, but there was a question. What do you think? Yeah. Well, we'll go ahead. The gentleman from North Carolina now, Mr. Holding.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Picking up on the role of the Burmese military, I mean, obviously it's ingrained into the rule of the country of Burma. And we know that any future constitutional reform or elections are going to have the Burmese military on board. And the Burmese military, as reported, is one of the top 15 militaries in the world in terms of size. But, you know, as regards to their exact budget and the spending on the Burmese military, we don't know that. Now, while this lack of transparency is a big concern, given Burma's neighbors. I think before the United States needs to, before we move any closer to military cooperation, we need to ensure that the Burmese military does not have excessive ties with China and North Korea, where those ties are severed. So which one of you on the panel could elaborate for us exactly what are the ties that the Burmese military has with the Chinese or with North Korea?
We won't be able to undo the extensive ties between the Chinese and the Burmese military. They are linked both militarily through, they have been the largest weapons supplier, the largest arms dealer for the Burmese military for decades. They are also economic partners. The Burmese military owns very large economic holdings in Burma, and that's predominantly who the Chinese do their business with. Particularly in the extractives and the energy sector. And so untangling the military, political, and economic relationship between the Burmese and Chinese is, I think, an unattainable goal. I think it's one that the U.S. is trying to slowly pull the Burmese away from the Chinese, and I think that's one of the primary reasons of our engagement policy. I think that the U.S. feels as if there is a greater potential to remove them from a relationship with North Korea, which includes transfer of weapons and technology, missile technology, and then there is concern potentially about a nuclear relationship. The Burmese government did just sign the additional protocol and will be allowing the IAEA into the country. And so that there is some promise, I would say, on trying to at least ascertain the nuclear relationship between Burma and North Korea. And several shipments have been stopped, weapons shipments have been stopped from North Korea to Burma. And so I think that actually was the focus of Secretary Hagel's interaction with the Burmese defense minister, was to try and more successfully pull them away from the North Koreans.
So what are the ways, or what ways are we using, and what ways would you suggest for driving a wedge between the relationship between Burma and China?
Well, to be honest, I think that the first thing that the U.S. I think is trying to achieve is to separate the Burmese military from economic activity. And so if you separate the Burmese military from economic activity, you separate an economic relationship that they have with the Chinese. And
so how do you do that?
Well, at the moment, the U.S. has said that if you want to invest if the Burmese military and their economic holdings want to invest with the Americans, which they do, that they have to divest. The Burmese military has to go from being an economic power inside Burma to being a professional military in Burma. And so we're holding out sort of, I guess you consider like we're dangling the carrot that if they divest, that they would have more of a relation, that the Burmese military would benefit more from a relationship with the United States. And so they're
on a military level, if they divested their economic
one of the administration's criteria for the Burmese military to be taken off of our sanctions list is to divest their economic holdings. And so that would be one way in which they would be able to pull them away from the Chinese, because the military would then no longer...
Is there anything that we're not doing that you would suggest would be a way to drive a wedge?
I think we should be more engaged when it comes to the ethnic negotiations that are taking place. The Chinese have a predominant role. So most of the fighting that's taking place is happening on the China border with the Shan, the Palong, and the Kachin. And the U.S. has resolutely stayed out of those negotiations, whereas the Chinese have played a very active role. And we have suggested that these communities have actually asked the U.S. to actively participate in the negotiation process so that therefore the Chinese don't have as much control as what happens in those regions in the country. Right now that's primarily a relationship between the Burmese military, the Chinese, and those ethnic groups. And so those ethnic groups have actually asked that the U.S. government become a more active player in those negotiation processes as a counterbalance to sort of neutralize the role that the Chinese have in that region of the country.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you for your remarks. Gentleman's time has expired. Let me just make a remark, the Chairman's prerogative here, I guess. I think sometimes there's a tendency in this country and I may be seeing this under this administration. I don't want to be too harsh with them because you see it occasionally, I think, throughout history where it's maybe it's natural for an administration to do this, but I think they kind of look for foreign policy successes wherever they can find them. And I think initially, with respect to Burma, it looked like this was going to be a tremendous success story. And kind of if it happens under your watch, you get some credit for it. And so I think there was perhaps a rush to put a happy face on Burma and be very optimistic about the outcome and to do a lot of positive things and give them everything and hope that everything was going to go well. And unfortunately, we've seen that there are still tremendous challenges in Burma and human rights abuses and the military still literally killing people. And so I think it's appropriate for us to reconsider our policy here and to move forward in a more cautious manner, I think, and make sure that our actions and our outreach will actually have a positive effect and not just reward bad behavior. So those are my thoughts. And I don't think, Dr. Uddin, we actually directed any questions to you. So I would give you this opportunity if you would like to perhaps comment on anything that you heard here this afternoon that you think needs to be commented upon.
Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity again to make statements. I want to emphasize on ethnic minority issues where I've been working as an ARU Director General, the rights of the ethnic minorities, particularly Rohingya issue. Currently, Ambassador Derek Mitchell has been working very diligently on this Rohingya issue, trying to find out a solution for this Rohingya people. So I think we should continue that path through State Department's effort working on this. But you know, the biggest problem we are having right now with in the Rohingya issue is what Myanmar government, Burmese government says from Naypyidaw is not consistent with what's happening on the ground. The more conciliatory talk, sometimes very negotiable talks coming out of Naypyidaw, each time that happens, you see more violence on the ground in Arakan state. There seems to be a disconnect between what's happening on the ground and what's come out of Naypyidaw. So international community, led by United States, the most powerful country in the world, need to take a look at that. Where is the missing gap? What's happening? Is that signal coming from the Naypyidaw to the forces on the ground to continue to commit this horrendous violence against Rohingya, or they are a breakdown of law and order? So I think that's one thing. That's something that I want to ask our government to pursue, that the security of the Rohingya people are addressed by the Myanmar government, because this is the place, Northern Arakan State is the place which the Myanmar government governs. So there has to be law and order. It cannot be a lawless state in Burma where the Myanmar government is governing that region. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank all the panel members this afternoon for their excellent testimony and their answering of the questions that we had. I thought you did a very, very good job and a particularly important country in the world right now that really does need, I think, a lot of focus. And I would ask unanimous consent that members have 5 days to supplement their comments or submit questions. And if there's no further business to come before the committee, we're adjourned. Thank you very much.